Hello and welcome to the Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. I'm Caroline Fisher, an Associate Professor of Journalism at the University of Canberra. Hi Michelle.
Hi Caroline.
Another crazy week in politics dominated by the coronavirus. So this week Melbourne lived through stage 4 restrictions, including a curfew and closure of businesses. The federal government announced a paid pandemic leave package, and Queensland is going to close its border with New South Wales and the ACT tomorrow at 1 a.m.
And that's only half of it.
Yes, that's right. In Melbourne, I mean, has the Victorian government gone too far with introducing this curfew?
Well, it's certainly an extreme measure, but I think that Victoria is pretty desperate at the moment. It's got several hundred cases a day. It goes up and down somewhat, but even at the lower level in the last few days, it's been bad, and at the upper level, it's been terrible. So I think that they do feel the need to do something very drastic. And of course, if this doesn't work and these stage 4 measures last a whole 6 weeks, if they don't work, then I think contemplating what comes beyond is awful.
So to encourage people to stay at home, the federal government has introduced this paid pandemic leave to cover those Victorians who need to isolate, etc., and don't have sick leave and other entitlements. Should that scheme be nationwide?
It'll certainly have to be nationwide if the virus breaks out seriously in other places. At the moment, it's contained. New South Wales remains precarious, but the other states are looking good. But I think that the government has indicated that it will extend it if necessary, but logically it should be a national scheme. The country's balkanised enough as it is.
Because at the moment it's a reactive response rather than a preventative one. I mean, the idea being to encourage people to stay at home?
Well, that's right, and there's been a patchwork of arrangements. Some companies have given that sort of leave, others haven't. The Victorian government moved for some people, but the problem is especially casual workers who are picking up 2 or 3 jobs, have no sick leave entitlements, and they think, oh well, I've got a minor cold, I'll go to work anyway. Well, it may be a minor cold or it may be something much worse.
Yeah, indeed. So the Senate committee into COVID-19 sat this week, and that was challenging as well, being sort of online and remote. That had its challenges. The Health Department head Brendan Murphy and the Minister for Aged Care Richard Colbeck were both questioned. And you wrote this week about the fact that they were quite hesitant to publicly provide details about some of the aged care centres in Victoria where there had been outbreaks. Is this type of secrecy acceptable?
I think it's not. I think we're talking about facilities that have had small numbers, not of course the ones that have now become notorious with bigger numbers. But given that COVID is really ripping through aged care facilities in Victoria, and that this is such a sensitive issue, I think that the public does have a right to know which facilities have had or have currently cases. I think that obviously the families do know, but it's important that that information be available. Now, what Brendan Murphy and the Minister were saying was that there were reputational issues. That's why the facilities didn't want to be named in many cases. The Minister said he didn't want a hit list. The facilities feel under media pressure when their name becomes public. But I think that the public interest overrides all those things. But there's a twist to this story, because a full list is available if people ask the Victorian government. The only thing they keep private are situations where deaths could identify an individual. But they're willing to provide the names of facilities, and so you've got this clash between federal and state governments in terms of what information is appropriate for the public to be given.
It's interesting. I mean, you know, from a public relations perspective, surely transparency is the best way forward, because to have it leaked that there is infection in your facility rather than be upfront about that, I mean, you know, that's not going to go down well either.
Well, remember these residencies are subsidised heavily by the taxpayer. They're under the general regulation of the federal government, and they involve very vulnerable people and, of course, health issues. And while the facilities with cases are not taking new people at the moment, families in the future, in the next 2 or 3 years, will be making decisions about where individuals go, and I think that information is relevant to those decisions.
The Minister and Brendan Murphy were also keen to tell the committee that the outbreaks in the nursing homes and the aged care facilities was inevitable given the community transmission. But advocates in the sector have been warning about the impact of, you know, low income, staff shortages, etc. for a long time now. I mean, really, was it inevitable?
I think it's hard to actually provide a definite answer to that question. And obviously some of the experts do think it was, but I think that in many cases it should have been preventable. Staff issues should have been better addressed. There seems to have been a real problem with the personal protective equipment, either staff not using it early enough, not being properly trained, not having enough of it at some stages. So I think that a lot more could have been done. And it is interesting that the Royal Commission on Aged Care, which of course in its interim report was quite scathing about the system, this is way pre-COVID, is having hearings next week on the aged care situation during COVID. So I think there'll be some quite enlightening evidence coming out of that.
I mean, we could anticipate, in fact, that some of the evidence being given at the inquiry next week for the Aged Care Commission and what was presented at the committee might be quite conflicting, in fact.
Well, we'll certainly presumably hear some evidence about this difference between the federal and state government on what you release. I should add that the federal government was willing to talk about this in camera. The issue is whether it's talked about publicly.
Sure. One of the things that's interesting is the status of these public servants, these public health officials these days. This week it was reported that Victorian Chief Health Officer Brett Sutton was retiring, and then Twitter went into a bit of a flurry about that, and it turns out that in fact he's just taking a few days off. But has the nature of the pandemic changed the way we view these public servants? They were once very, you know, silent background figures.
Well, it's made them very public figures. They've been front and centre, attending or standing beside their leaders at press conferences, and so we've become familiar with names that previously, frankly, most of us had never heard of. I think in some cases, while the public has given a lot of respect to these figures, they have become controversial in the debate about how to handle the pandemic, and that's particularly the case with Brett Sutton, but also some others as well. And there's another rather quirky aspect to this, because as they've become so well known to the public, they've sort of taken on the nature of cult figures. Now with Brett Sutton, you can buy a whole range of household items, mugs, throw blankets and the like, with his face on them.
Merch.
I mean, merchandise. Who would have ever thought that a chief health officer of a state would have his own line in merchandise? Not that he's produced it, I might stress. But Brendan Murphy, who was Chief Medical Officer federally, now head of the Health Department, there's no merchandise for Murphy, I don't think, but certainly he was receiving a lot of respect in the public mind. And I remember when we did the university did some work in Eden Monaro, he came up as a highly respected figure. And in the private sector, Norman Swan, of course, on the ABC has an immense following and also has become a bit of a controversial figure too, often attacked by news corp outlets. So it is quite a thing, these public health figures.
Yeah, I mean, it's a deliberate strategy though, isn't it? It's a deliberate communication strategy to sort of separate these operational issues from, say, policy issues. And it's a well-worn tradition that, you know, a minister will respond to media inquiries or public inquiries in relation to policy positions, and then they'll put up the public servant to deal with the controversial kind of operational issue.
Well, that's true, but I think this goes even well beyond that, and to some extent the politicians are leaning on the authority of these public health officials, but because there's debate within the health community about what sort of measures should be brought in, for example over masks, that was quite a big issue and we were quite late to the party on that. Therefore, these public officials get caught up as time goes on in the controversies.
Yes, indeed. So another area which may well generate more controversy is the cyber security package that the federal government announced yesterday, and they're extending the powers and funding to the Australian Signals Directorate and to the Australian Federal Police. Are these new powers necessary?
Certainly the government would argue that they are. I think that they do generate some issues of privacy and the powers of these bodies, the Australian Signals Directorate, which is of course not a well-known body and not and somewhat opaque, but nevertheless the argument is that we do need to protect critical infrastructure more carefully from cyber attacks. These have been increasing, especially from China. And in terms of the police, we're talking about very serious crimes, we're talking about terrorist activities, the dark web here, child exploitation and so on. So it's always going to be a balance, and presumably the Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security will be scrutinising that legislation. The government would like to get it through by the end of the year, which is tight, but the issues that are involved in terms of privacy versus public interest will be debated there, one would think.
Do you think Labor will support the legislation?
I'm not sure at this stage. I think that its approach generally on these issues is to try and iron out wrinkles in that committee.
Okay. Last time we spoke, there was a bipartisan attempt to come up with a solution for Parliament sitting because it had been cancelled due to COVID. What have they come up with, and is it going to work?
Well, they were working on a number of options, but the Prime Minister, from what I can gather, seems to have stepped in and made some decisions here. And we were talking about the public health officials earlier gaining clout and authority. Well, the acting Chief Medical Officer, federal, Paul Kelly, has said to the Prime Minister that Victorian parliamentarians coming here should isolate for 2 weeks, either in Canberra or in Victoria. Now, isolate means, home isolation means that you're locked down, can't go out, can't have people in, and your family is too. And this is pretty onerous. This has been accepted by the government. So, for example, you've got Josh Frydenberg and Greg Hunt isolating in Canberra for 2 weeks from this Sunday night. So I don't know whether they're in hotels or they have their own accommodation, but it's going to be quite challenging for those ministers. It does seem a really tough provision, I must say.
What about the politicians from Queensland?
Well, the politicians from Queensland have a different sort of problem. Their problem's not coming in. They can come in all right, but because...
Can't go back.
they can't go back
They'll
without
discover
isolating.
the secrets of the ACT and how wonderful
That's
it
right.
is.
Well, the border was closed between the ACT and Queensland. Well, that's actually from Saturday morning.
Yep.
And that's because Queensland feared that people in New South Wales were trying to be sneaky and get in via flying from Canberra. Apparently only one person tried, but everyone's very twitchy at the moment. So the Queensland government is actually looking at the provisions for that isolation as they go back, whether that's home isolation or quarantined in a hotel for those Queenslanders. So the whole parliamentary sitting is frankly a bit of a mess. They're also at the moment looking at the possibility of some Victorians in particular dialing in remotely, but they wouldn't be able to vote. And because of the sort of pattern of the sitting times, it means that a Victorian like say Josh Frydenberg would only be able to, between this weekend and about December 10, when the Parliament gets up, would only be able to go home to Victoria for a fortnight. So I think that common sense suggests that they might need to somehow rearrange the sitting times a bit to do more in less time.
Well, common sense. Okay, well, we'll leave that there. Anyway, look forward to speaking to you again in a fortnight, Michelle.
Thanks a lot, Caroline.